What you're looking at right here is the TBS Sixty9, and it is a TBS Unify video transmitter and Crossfire or Tracer receiver built into one board. And in this video, we're going to go over the TBS Sixty9. We'll talk about how to set it up, what it can do, how to use it. But in addition, I want to take a minute to think about a debate that I've seen play out for the last 5 or 6 years that I've been in FPV. And that is, which is better, to have individual components that you wire up yourself, or to have the manufacturer just put everything onto one board and have you install it in your quad? I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. As I said in the intro, the TBS Sixty9 is a combination Unify video transmitter and Crossfire or Tracer receiver. And so obviously the kind of person who's going to think about buying this is going to be a person who is flying maybe a Tango 2 or a Mambo or any other radio with Crossfire or Tracer as their control link. The inclusion of a Unify video transmitter is, I think, going to be fairly non-controversial. They are one of, if not the best 5.8 gigahertz analog video transmitter that's out there. So you're not really giving up much by going with this. And that certainly calls into mind a comparison between the Sixty9 and the ImmersionRC Ghost hybrid. Because the Ghost hybrid has an ImmersionRC Ghost receiver built in and a ImmersionRC Tramp video transmitter. And the Tramp video transmitter goes up to 600 milliwatts. How much does the TBS Sixty9 put out? We'll see that a little bit later in the video. Suffice it to say that for a freestyle rig, for a racing rig, you need 25 milliwatts. Who cares? But for a freestyle rig, I want as much output power as I can get. And I feel like 800 milliwatts is like, I'd like a watt, or maybe I'd like even more than a watt, which some video transmitters will do. Although they won't say that they do it because the FCC doesn't like it. But 600 milliwatts on the Ghost hybrid, I make do because I like the Ghost hybrid on some of my rigs, but I always wished that it had more output power than 600 milliwatts. So the TBS Sixty9 has a built-in Unify, and if it outputs as much power as a Unify does, then it may represent a relatively no compromises approach. Why would you bother using a separate Crossfire receiver and separate Unify VTX? One reason, obviously, is repairability. If one of these things breaks, then you're going to be replacing the whole thing. Whereas if they're separate units, then if one breaks, you can replace only the one that broke. That being said, TBS hardware is pretty reliable. And also, that being said, the price of the Sixty9 is not that much different than the price of just a Unify video transmitter by itself. So if the TBS Sixty9 outputs as much output power as a traditional Unify, then it represents a relatively no compromises approach. Why wouldn't you go with the TBS Sixty9 versus a discrete receiver and video transmitter? And the obvious answer is that if something breaks and you have discrete components, then you can replace only the thing that broke. Whereas if it's integrated, you got to replace the whole thing. That being said, TBS hardware has a pretty good reputation for reliability, unless you're like knocking capacitors off the side of your Crossfire receiver. Okay, so not bulletproof. The other thing to keep in mind is that the price of the Sixty9 is not that much different from the price of a TBS Unify. So maybe you're just getting a Crossfire or a Tracer receiver for free is one way to look at it. The TBS Sixty9 has 20 millimeter M3 mounting holes, and that means it's going to mount easily on a lot of the frames out there. Racing frames are probably going to have a 20 millimeter main stack, and it'll mount 3 high on the stack, ESC, flight controller, and VTX / receiver. Freestyle frames will often have 20 millimeter mounting in the rear of the stack, and it will easily mount back there. The fact that it's M3 mounting may upset some people because some frames only have sizing for M2 screws. You can get bushings or like spacers that go in an M3 hole and size it down to M2 if that's what you really got to do. You can also drill your frame out to size up the holes from M2 to M3. The Sixty9 comes with this mounting hardware, and you're not going to necessarily use all of it. So the first piece we'll look at is this metal piece, which is designed to give just a little bit of additional electromagnetic shielding. It's technically optional, but I kind of don't know why you wouldn't use it. And then assuming that you're going to go with 20 millimeter mounting, there is this plastic piece here, which goes on top, and then this plastic piece here fits down in it, and it all goes together in one nice little case. Obviously, all of that's completely optional, and if you're extremely concerned about weight, you wouldn't use any of this. You would just mount the naked board. What if you intend to mount on top of a 30mm stack? And that's what this last piece is for, and fits down on top, just like the 20mm piece. The screws go in and hold it all together, and then there's additional tabs for 30mm mounting. Oh, it clips down in, doesn't it? Isn't that something? Yeah, it's even got these little clips here that holds it all together. That's really slick. As far as weight goes, the board itself comes in at about 4 grams, and then if you add some of the plastic pieces, we're up around 6 or 7 grams. And how that weight compares to Crossfire and a Unify depends on which Unify you're comparing against. If you're building a racing rig with the Unify Nano, then this is going to be a little bit heavier. If you're building a freestyle rig with the full-size Unify Pro 32, then this is going to be significantly lighter. Obviously, the reason the Unify Pro 32 is heavier is that it's got a lot more weight. A lot more metal, and that affects its ability to dissipate heat. We could expect that this naked board isn't going to dissipate heat as well as a full-size VTX. Then again, if you're flying in the airflow from the props, heat dissipation tends not to be an issue. So as long as you're not sitting around powered up for a long time, maybe it won't matter. We also have to point out that TBS has said that this plastic is not, it's like some kind of thermal plastic that will not significantly insulate the board. So if you're worried about heat dissipation, I mean, obviously having anything covering the board is probably going to reduce the heat dissipation somewhat, but it's not going to be as bad as some people have suspected it might be. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do when you get your 69 out is you're going to want to bind it and update the firmware. And in order to do that, you're going to need to update. In order to do that, you're going to need to update the firmware on your Crossfire module to the latest version. And specifically, you're going to want at least version 6.09, which is only just released as of the day I'm recording this. The reason for that is, well, if you've got a really early version of Crossfire, like 4 point something, then it actually just doesn't support the 69 at all. So you have to upgrade. But version 6.09 adds a key capability that people asked for that wasn't available at release. And we'll talk about that a little later in the video. You're definitely going to want to be on at least 6.09 or newer. In order to bind this, obviously we're going to need to power it up. And one thing to point out is that the 69 comes with this JST SH plug, and the input voltage is rated for 5.5 to 36 volts. So it will not run on a 5-volt regulator if you've got a flight controller with a 5-volt regulator only, but it will run on, well, basically any VBAT that you're probably likely to use. So I'm just going to take the red and the black wire, which are the power supply, and I'm going to hook them up to my bench supply here. The bench supply that I'm using is the Toolkit RC P200. I've got a review of it. It's a nice little lightweight, not too expensive bench supply, and I'll put a link down in the video description if you want to check it out. This seems like the perfect time to go over the wiring diagram of the 69 real quick. As I said, we've got the red and the black wires here, which are VBAT and ground. The orange and black wire is 5-volt out and ground, and that's to power a camera. If, like, for example, if you had a fixed wing with no flight controller and no other source of 5 volts, you could just run the camera straight off the power supply in the 69. Most of the time, if you're using a flight controller, the flight controller will have a voltage regulator, and the wiring will be simpler and neater if you just power the camera directly from the flight controller. So most of the time, if you are using a flight controller and a multi-rotor, you would remove the orange and black wire and not use them. Next, we have the video wire, which obviously is going to come from either the camera or the flight controller, depending on whether, if you have a typical flight controller with an OSD, then the camera will go to the flight controller will go to the video input on the 69. There's an audio input, which you'll use if you have a microphone. If you don't have a microphone, then you won't be using that. And the 69 does not have a built-in microphone. There's an additional ground wire here, and that ground wire would only be used if you had a separate microphone, so you had audio and ground going to somewhere else. So again, if you're not using a microphone, you won't be using that. And then there is an additional output. This is the Crossfire output 1 and output 2, and that is what you would connect to your flight controller instead of your Crossfire receiver. Basically is the outputs of your Crossfire receiver. Now, before I power up the 69, I'm going to want to make sure I install my antennas. I've got a Crossfire antenna here, and it comes with a UFL SMA pigtail here. I'm going to need to get a little oh, here's one right here. We'll put an antenna on there. TBS Crossfire and Unify are usually designed to be very resistant to damage. They won't fry themselves immediately if you power them up without an antenna, but it's still not a good idea. And we've got 2 plugs here. One is labeled VTX, and that's the 5.8 gigahertz output for the video transmitter. And we've got RC here. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to hold down the menu key. We're going to go into the Crossfire menu, and we are going to start binding on the Crossfire module. And we're going to power this guy up, and it should automatically go into binding mode since it's fresh from the factory. Here we go. If not, then you would power it up, and after powering up, you would press the bind button, which is right over here. Oh, and sure enough, update micro RX. Yes, I'm going to click, and now, sorry about that. Now we're going to wait. I'll check my message while I wait for that to update. And by the way, if you're used to the status LEDs on a Crossfire receiver, here they are here. And if you're used to the status LEDs on a Unify video transmitter, here they are here. It's the exact same. Let's see, let's take the Tango out of binding mode, and let's power cycle. This is the latest firmware. This is the latest version of TBS Agent X that is supposed to fix this issue. There's an issue where after you bind in firmware update, it isn't bound, and they're supposed to have fixed it. Let's try binding again. It says binding complete. And there we go. Solid green LED. Yay, now we're bound. Now at this point, I want to take you through some of the setup options on the 69 that may be a little bit unfamiliar to you if you've never dealt with the TBS MyVTX function before. And the thing to keep in mind here is that the TBS Crossfire receiver is directly connected to the Unify video transmitter within the 69. And this is something that you've always been able to do. I made a video tutorial about it. It's called MyVTX, and it lets you manage your video transmitter without ever going through the flight controller. Now that would be great if you didn't have a flight controller, such as if you had a fixed wing, but some people prefer to manage their VTX using the TBS system because they find it, well, they just prefer it to the way that Betaflight does it. So if we take a look here, we've got XF69RX, and if we go in here, we have options to change the VTX band, channel, power, and whether pit mode is enabled or disabled. And that's exactly what you would do. Instead of going into the Betaflight OSD, instead of going into the Betaflight video transmitter tab, instead of screwing around with VTX tables and all that BS, it just works. By the way, if you have a Ghost hybrid, it has a similar functionality, and if you want to compare that to the TBS MyVTX functionality we're looking at here, I put a link in the video description. Some of the things Ghost does are pretty freaking cool, especially if you're into team racing, but even if you're not. Check that out when you're done here. So here we've got the VTX options, band, we'll go ahead and put that on, race band, of course we will, race band, channel, doesn't matter, channel 8. I like to use race 8. Because race 8, Wi-Fi stops at around race 6. So if you're on race 7 or 8, you won't interfere with the Wi-Fi network. Oh, a little tip for you there. Power, pit mode, enable or disable. And then here we've got the Crossfire receiver options. And these are the exact same options that you would have in any Crossfire receiver. And I go over these in a video about Crossfire setup. We're not going to sort of duplicate that content here. I'll put a link. If you're new to Crossfire, you check that video out. Obviously, some of the stuff in it won't be relevant because you're using the 69, but the setup options will be relevant. Now, TBS's assumption is that, of course, you're going to want to use the Crossfire MyVTX function to manage your VTX, but a lot of people prefer to use Betaflight SmartAudio. Why? Well, some people are just used to their workflow and that's how they want it. But Betaflight has some capabilities to manage the VTX that the TBS does not. For example, in Betaflight, there's a function you can set up that lets you use a switch, such as the 6-position switch on the Radiomaster TX16S to change the VTX. So for example, people will set up those switches to change their channels. I've got a video about how to do that, and it's linked down in the video description if you want to check it out. Fortunately, if you want to use Betaflight to control your VTX, you do have the option to do that. And this is the feature that TBS added in firmware 6.09 that didn't exist at release. In order to do that, well, it's a little bit confusing because here we are in the 69 output map, and you'll see that output 4 is set to SmartAudio. And that's always true for Crossfire receivers. The receiver will output SmartAudio to remote control of VTX. But the release notes for firmware 609 say that SmartAudio on IO4 allows the input of SmartAudio control from a flight controller to let the flight controller remote control the VTX. So this is a case where this is apparently an input, not an output. Now, outputs 3, 4, 5, and 6 are not in the plug on the top of the 69. That only contains outputs 1 and 2. To get outputs 3, 4, 5, and 6, you need to go to these solder pads on the underside of the 69. Also, please notice that these labels in the Crossfire manual are offset by 1. They are not correct. So ground is actually here. Output 3 is actually here. Output 4 is actually here. I'm sure TBS will fix this very shortly. But in the default channel mapping, output 4 is set to SmartAudio. So if you wanted to use SmartAudio to control your 69, you would take that output 4 TX, which is mapped to SmartAudio by default, and you would connect that to the UART TX pad on your flight controller that you were using for SmartAudio, and that's how that would work. Well, now we come to the big question that is on everybody's mind, and that is how much output power does it put out? Because that's going to play a big part in whether it's the right decision for you. Max freestyle range, you may want the 1 watt plus of the full-size TBS Unify Pro 32. But if this guy puts out the same amount of power, well, it'll be mighty tempting. In order to answer that question, we are going with this ImmersionRC RF power meter. This is the limited edition Rotorriot branded one. I don't think you can get this anymore, but you can get this power meter if you want to. There's a link in the video description of my review of it if you want to check out what it's good for. The short version is that it is not as accurate as a full, $30,000 RF analyzer, but it is enough to get a general sense of what the power is doing. We shouldn't try to, like if this says that we output 20 milliwatts instead of 25, don't freak out. We're just getting ballpark numbers. And by the way, because I know some of you have pointed this out before, yes, I am using an attenuator to make sure that we don't exceed the 1 watt input power of this device. So we're going to power it up, and it is set to 25 milliwatts on race band 8. And we are seeing about 40 milliwatts, but it is going down as heat builds up. Let's change the output power here. We're going to change it from 25 up to, let's just go to max power. And you can't see it here, but it doesn't say an output power. It just says 400, 100, 25, and max power. Here we go. Maximum power. And you can see here, sitting on the bench, we're getting max power around 700 milliwatts. And it is quickly going down as the heat builds up. Let's get a fan, and let's blow a fan on this and see what happens. We're at 50 milliwatts. If we just super overheated, let's put the fan on it. Yeah, it was in heat protection mode for sure. Now we're jumping up again. Can we make it any higher? No, it won't go. It's holding at about 750. Let's try 400. Yeah, it's about 470 and 100. About 100 and 25. It's interesting. It's holding at about 25. It seems to be reading a little bit high on all. So it seems to be reading a little bit high on the 25, 100, and 400 milliwatt output, which could be the VTX, but more likely it's just this meter. But it does seem to be roughly in the ballpark. The max power output seems to be outputting 750 milliwatts, which I swear I saw Gal Kremer report that it was outputting over a watt. I'm not sure what's causing that difference. But at least from my measurements, max power seems to be about 750, and everything else seems to be roughly in the ballpark of correct. So that brings us to the end of the video, and as always, the question, should you buy it? And I think for a lot of people who are running Crossfire, the answer to this question is going to be absolutely yes. The price of this unit is $50, and $50 is roughly what you'll pay for a Unify Pro 32 HV. Now, a Unify Pro 32 HV outputs 1 watt plus. Some people have measured it at up to 1.3 or 1.4 watts. The TBS Sixty9 is rated at up to 1 watt with perfect cooling. And with a fan blowing on it, you saw that I got about 750 milliwatts. Now that's going to be more than a lot of people want or need. It's going to be enough. But if you want the absolute maximum range, you're going to want to go with a more powerful VTX. If that 750-ish milliwatts max power is enough for you, though, this is basically like getting a Crossfire receiver for free. Sort of. Okay, if you squint at it, it's a pretty good deal. The 20mm mounting, of course, is going to be very convenient for most builds, and it's going to simplify your wiring somewhat because you're not going to have separate wiring between the receiver and the VTX. Then again, does it simplify your wiring? I mean, if you prefer to use Crossfire to control your VTX, it does simplify your wiring because you don't have to wire SmartAudio to your flight controller. And you don't have to set up your ports tab and your video transmitter tab and your VTX table. But if you prefer to use Betaflight to control your VTX, then the wiring and the setup isn't any simpler. It's not any more complicated either. Now, I don't have the tracer version of this unit, but one difference with the tracer version is that the Sixty9 tracer doesn't have diversity. And that's one of the selling points of tracer, is that it has diversity antennas to sort of maximize your range. And some people see that as a downside, especially given that tracer doesn't have the greatest of range to begin with. It has okay range, it has good range by some standards, but not compared to something like Crossfire, Express LRS, or Ghost. So for some people, the fact that the tracer doesn't have diversity is going to be a deal breaker. I guess if you think about it, the Crossfire doesn't have a diversity either, but Crossfire Nano, a lot of people use the Crossfire Nano and it doesn't have diversity either. If you're an ultra long range pilot who needs a diversity receiver for Crossfire, then that would also be a deal breaker for you. You're probably going to want a more powerful VTX too, though. We also have to at least acknowledge the existence of the ImmersionRC Ghost hybrid. Now, the question of whether you would prefer Crossfire, Ghost, or Tracer as your control link is a big one. And I've got a video with a control link roundup listing some of the pros and cons of these different control links. There's also Express LRS, which doesn't have a hybrid video transmitter and receiver, but deserves at least a mention. Link in the video description if you want to do more research on that. The Ghost Hybrid, I criticized it at the beginning of the video for only going to 600 milliwatts. Turns out that that's closer to what the Sixty9 seems to do than I at first thought. The Sixty9 will do 1 watt nominally, but in my test at least, it did about 750 milliwatts, which is pretty close. That means that the main question would be whether you like Ghost better than Tracer or Crossfire as a control link, and the Ghost Hybrid's VTX management features are pretty cool and at least deserve a look compared to what Crossfire is doing with MyVTX. I've got videos on both, and as you might expect, they're linked in the video description. That's going to do it for this video, though. If you are interested in getting a TBS Sixty9, there are links down in the video description, and there are affiliate links. And what that means is that when you click that link and then make any purchase and check out at the affiliated vendor, I get a small commission. It doesn't cost you anything. You want to go buy a Sixty9? Click the link, go buy a Sixty9, check out. You want to buy anything? Click an affiliate link, go do your shopping and check out. It's an easy way to support me. It doesn't cost you anything. Thanks so much for watching. Happy flying. Hey there, it's me. End of the episode, Joshua. I'm just out here taking a walk with my dog. If this is the first time we've met, nice to see you. And if this is the second, third, fourth, 17th time we've met, you sure seem to like my content. So I hope you're subscribed. And maybe you could think about joining my Patreon, where you can support me for a couple dollars a month and help buy dog food for Mamba here. He's not named after a flight controller. He had that name when we got him, but it sure is a nice coincidence. Oh, here's some videos I thought you might like. Anything to say to the people, Mamba?